Recording in progress.
Okay, we can start. Good evening or good afternoon or good morning even, everyone, wherever you are. And welcome back to our first ASEN event for 2022. And I should have said a very happy new year to everybody. I'm really happy to be chairing this event today and welcome my friends and colleagues to talk about the recent book on Vox, The Rise of the Spanish Radical Right. I'm Daphne. I know everyone knows me by now. I am the Vice President of ASEN and Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Reading, and this is indeed my topic too. I'm really interested in the radical right, so I'm really looking forward. Just very quickly to say that the authors of the book, José Rama, Lisa Zanotti, Stuart Turnbull-Dugarte, and Andrés Santana, they're all apparently for the first time together presenting their book, and I in turn will present them in a little bit more detail in a moment. But first, just to very, very briefly introduce our event. As I said, this is their book on Vox, and Vox is a really fascinating party. I think Spain itself is a really fascinating case because scholars of the radical right have treated it as a sort of negative case for a really long time. So Spain is puzzling because unlike some other cases, it didn't really have a strong far right, as I call it, or radical right party after the economic crisis or later with the, with the rapid waves of immigration. And then Vox was created in 2013, but had actually little impact in Spanish politics until 2018, where everything changed. So there is a lot of work on actually, why Spain hasn't had a radical right party. And I think that it is now time to hear why Spain now has a radical right party, why it has become important in the Spanish political scene, who votes for it, why, and how potentially it compares with other radical right parties across Europe. I think I was actually, I'm happy to say that I read the book. I was among the first because I also wrote an endorsement for it. And I think it is indeed the first I know of systematic analysis in the English language of this party. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Our speakers will have their own order, the way that they have arranged it. So I'll just introduce them in the order that I have. But that's not necessarily the order they will be presenting in. So our first author is José Rama. He's lecturer in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid in Spain. I don't know if I did that well. He holds a PhD in political science from the same university. He has published in a number of leading journals, including, amongst others, the Journal of Democracy, Government and Opposition, and the European Political Science Review. Lisa Zanotti is associate researcher at Instituto de Investigación en Ciencias Sociales, Universidad Diego Portales in Chile, holds a joint PhD in political science from Diego Portales University and in humanities from Leiden University, the Netherlands. She has also recently published in a number of leading journals, including Political Studies Review and Comparative European Politics. Next, Stuart Turnbull-Dugarte is assistant professor at the University of Southampton, I can definitely pronounce that one, in the UK. He holds a PhD in political science from King's College London and has published also in a number of leading journals, including European Journal of Political Research, Journal of European Public Policy, West European Politics, and Electoral Studies. Finally, last but not least, is Andrés Santana, an assistant professor of political science, also at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid in Spain. He researches in voting behavior, populist parties, turnout, and the decision to vote, women's political representation, and research methodology. He has recently also published in leading journals, including Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties, Social Politics, Politics and Gender, and East European Politics. So each of our speakers, as I said, in their own arranged order, will talk about Vox. They have 10 minutes each, and that will leave us with circa 20 to 30 minutes for discussion. We are now live on Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook, and you know the drill. You can ask your questions either on the chat or whichever medium you're using, and they will be passed on to me. I think this is it from me, so I'm going to just over to you, Jose.
Okay. Okay, Daphne, many thanks for the presentations. Many thanks for the good words regarding our previous work, etc. Let me start by sharing my screen because, as many of the academics, I feel a little bit naked without a presentation. So let me share this with all of you. Let me check. Okay, all of you are seeing my presentation. It is right?
No, Jose, I'm seeing your
sorry,
Google Gmail or whatever.
Yeah, no. Now I think that I am sharing with you my presentation. Okay, yes. So let me just introduce the plan or the idea of this book. In other presentations that I previously have talking about the book of VOX, the rise of the Spanish populist radical right party, I started by talking about the idea of the book. When I started thinking on the idea of this book, and I think that this book starts with an article that Andrés, Stuart, and myself published in Political Research Exchange, trying to identify the electoral basis of VOX. So I think this article, using post-electoral data from the April 2019 general elections in Spain, was the first step to then develop this idea, or the idea to write a book about the new populist radical right party in Spain, this new party called VOX. The truth is that this article was started by Andrés and myself, and then we sent an email to Stuart to jointly collaborate in this piece, because Stuart wrote the first empirical article about the electoral basis of VOX. Stuart wrote an article about the electoral basis of VOX in Andalusia. That was the first time that that VOX emerged. In like other populist radical right parties, VOX emerged in second-order elections. In this case, at the subnational level, at the regional elections. This is something very common in this type of parties that emerge in European elections, etc. But the truth is that as VOX emerged in Andalusia, but nowadays VOX is the third largest party in the Spanish national parliament. VOX has presence not only at the national level, but also at the regional, local, and European level. So that means that VOX is a very important or a key actor in Spanish politics. And this is something very interesting. And that's why we decided to try to address the relevance of VOX in different dimensions. In December 2019, we drew the first proposal of this book. And with this proposal, we sent it to the editors of Extremism Democracy of the Routledge series, and in 3 weeks they accept our proposal. The book was finished in October 2020. I was checking my emails. It's not something that, you know, I was checking in my emails to find this information. But the book was finished in October 2020, and then with some revisions, etc., the book, and this book, let me promote our book in the hardcover format. This book was finally out in July 2021. So, well, the book is the first book that covers all of these dimensions, not only the introduction of the contextualization, but also a chapter that focuses on the different aspects of the Spanish party system, focusing as well on the different actors of VOX, the relevance of VOX in our party system. Then we analyze the supply and the demand side. So we analyze both the electoral manifesto of VOX, but also the electoral basis of VOX. And of course, we try to determine the relationship between VOX and democracy. And this is something very relevant, because some authors claim that this type of parties could mean a peril for the survival of democracy. So in a chapter or in a specific chapter, we try to address all of this. The idea today is to disentangle of all of these chapters and analyze very briefly all of these chapters and show you, well, some pieces of evidence that are presented in our book. The truth is that the context is a very polarized context. See the graph, see the chart done by my very good friend Stuart, and see the evolution of the levels of polarization. It's in 2015, with the emergence of Podemos and Ciudadanos, new parties, when Spanish party system faced some changes on the levels of polarization. Now, with the emergence of VOX, we reach the top in the levels of polarization. And this is the context nowadays in Spanish politics, right? So, as I previously said, the regional elections of Andalusia in December 2019 was just the first step. VOX entering the Andalusian parliament with 10% of the votes, or more than 10% of the votes, if I'm not mistaken, 12 seats. But the truth is that just some months before, in Madrid, in the Vista Alegre Stadium, VOX was able to fill more than 9,000 sympathizers in this stadium. So, you know, the polls started to say that maybe VOX could be a new phenomenon. And it's really a new phenomenon that emphasizes new issues of electoral competition. The first one is the conflict, or the national conflict, boosted by the Catalan secessionist process, etc., etc. But the second one is the conflict with immigration, right? Or is the idea of the immigration. I think that all of these ideas are incorporated in our book, and in the different chapters, we will try to present all of this. So please, Andrés, your turn.
Thank you. Now it's okay. Thank you, Jose, and good afternoon, evening, morning, everyone. So, what I will share is briefly some aspects of the context in which VOX emerged, which help us to answer the question on why did VOX emerge in a given moment and not before? Because as Jose said before, Daphne, I think it was, Spain is a country which was seen as a negative case, a country which was no good ground for radical right or far right parties. So the first thing that would be interesting to see is that in most of Spanish electoral history, up to at least 2008, we see that most of the votes and most of the seats are concentrated on the two largest parties. And we start to see in 2011 and quite more strongly 2015 onwards that the share of the two big parties falls drastically, thereby opening the space for new parties to come. We can talk about that in the Q&A part of the presentation, but let me show you now the differences by PSOE and PP, because there is something more in the next slide. In this slide, I kept only the vote share and not the seat share, because 4 lines would be too much. So we kept only the vote shares. But the darkest line is the PPs, the right, the traditional right People's Party, and the other line, the gray one, is the one of the PSOE, Socialist Party. So if you see where the descent of the party's votes takes place, it can be appreciated that at the beginning, 2011, 2015, 16, the Socialist Party was hit quite strongly in terms of electoral revenue, but the People's Party, although it lost some revenue in 2015, in 2011 had not been hit at all. Actually, it had a very strong revenue, and it was actually only in 2019 when the People's Party, when the window of opportunity really opened on the right-hand side of the Spanish party system. So let's have a look at what happened in terms of electoral revenue of VOX. We have divided this also in two different slides. One of the first period from its birth, say 2013 to 2014. Actually, it was December 2013, but that doesn't matter very much. Until late 2018. Can we see the next one, Jose? If you see, up to 2017. VOX either did not even run in most of the elections, or it got very, very humble electoral results. In the here you have both you have European parliamentary elections, different regional elections, because not all of them take place on the same dates in Spain, local or municipal elections, and many regional elections. And you see that in about half the regional elections, VOX did not even attempt to run. In all the other elections in which VOX ran, it did not get any seats at all. The only exception being local elections, but it got 0.3 of the votes and 0.03 of the seats. So in the first years when VOX competed, and when the window of opportunity was only opened in the left-hand side of the political spectrum, there were other parties emerging in Spain, like Podemos or Ciudadanos. We can talk about who they are in the Q&A also. But VOX seemed to be just another iteration of unsuccessful far-right parties in Spain. Let's see what happened in the second part of VOX's life. The jump is from the last 2017 elections to December 2018, and we see that here in almost all elections, VOX starts to become important. There was an erosion in the right-hand side of the political spectrum due to several reasons, like corruption and like the Catalan challenge in the some months before. And we can see that the first election where VOX was successful was this Andalusian elections, analyzed in our beloved Stuart's paper on Andalusia. But we can see that in almost all the elections, VOX got relatively good results. 11% in Andalusia, 10% in Valencia, 7% in Congress, 10% in Congress, 15% in Congress in the second 2019 elections. So what we see from all this data is that once the political window of opportunity was opened on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, given among other factors to the corruption cases and to the Catalan territorial issue, on which our co-authors will keep on talking more, VOX could establish itself as a successful and repeatedly successful political party. And before handing the floor to Lisa, I would just like to clarify one point in two last slides. The point is that who are these? Who is this new party? Who are their leaders? Well, we see that if we look at the leaders, we see that most of the leaders come from previous positions in the People's Party, in the PP, the traditional right-wing party in Spain, or are closely related to it. And if we see the voters, we can also see that the biggest source of voters from VOX comes from the PP. The first column is showing in the April 2019 elections how many of their voters come from PP, Citizens, and other parties. And as you can see, the PP, the People's Party, furnishes 3 out of 5 votes of VOX in its first successful national election. And the second column, obviously, you get smaller numbers because a part of voters had already voted in the first 2019 election to VOX, but the PP is still the main source of voters for the party. And I think that now it's time to hand the floor to Lisa. Please, Lisa.
Thank you, Andrés, and thank you, Daphne and David, for the invitation. So I'm going to present chapter 3, which we call What Does VOX Want? And the main idea of this chapter is basically assessing the supply side, the ideology of VOX, by analyzing its discourse. And to do that, we basically examine the electoral manifesto of the party, both in comparative perspective with the other parties in the Spanish system, and with other populist radical right parties outside of Spain, in Europe, and outside of Europe. So basically, the chapter is divided in 3 sections. In the first section, we assess the political positions of VOX. I think Jose is the other table, if you, this. So here, if you just look at VOX, we found that the main issues that VOX basically politicizes are the national way of life, which counts for the more than 10% of the manifesto. And to be clear, we're talking of the April 2019 manifesto. Then came law and order with more than 9%. Then we have traditional morality, favorable mention of traditional morality, and we have a welfare state expansion, and then I believe we have also immigration, which is not here because it's not a single category and we had to create an index, but immigration counts for, if I'm not mistaken, 8% of the manifesto. So to go through these categories very briefly, the first one is the way of life. Basically picks up on favorite references to a country's national history, appeal of the citizen's pride and patriotism, nationalism, and things like that. The second, which is law and order, which is typical of populist radical right parties, basically shows support for policy proposal related to, for example, more power to police, more funds for police, etc. And tougher laws, security laws. And then we have immigration, and for this we created an index in which we add assimilation and statement towards potential new immigrants. And then we have traditional morality, as I was telling you before, which is basically favorable mentions to traditional heteronormative family, religion, etc. And then we have welfare state expansion, which basically entails expansion of the welfare state. So we also have a part, the second section of the chapter, in which trying to respond to the question that Andrés was telling you before about why VOX emerged in a certain at a certain time. We basically analyze the Spanish party system from a cleavage-based point of view. To make it short, I think we have, let me see. Jose, can you, we don't have this part, right? No, we don't have it. But basically, we analyze the main cleavages that order the structure of the Spanish party system, and saw that basically over time the what is called center periphery cleavage basically became more and more irrelevant at the expenses of both the welfare state, in general, the right-left cleavage. And then in the last part, we did a sort of comparative work, and we compare basically VOX Manifesto with other populist radical right in Europe, the former Front National, the People's Party in Austria, and then some populist radical right parties or leaders outside Europe. We saw Donald Trump, the Republican Party, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and José Antonio Cast in Chile. And we tried to see if there were any kind of patterns in the issues that they politicized most. So we can, just looking at the table, we can see that, for example, law and order is very strong in almost all of them. The only exception is the Republican Party, because they were very strong in the military issue, which is different from the law and order issue. But I think I can say that all of them are very strong on this one. And then the other thing I wanna, we have the welfare state expansion, because we know that populist radical right tends to be welfare chauvinist. So that in the discourse, they want more welfare states, but just for natives. So we see that mainly in Europe, welfare state expansion is a relevant issue. So I think now it's Stuart's turn, and then I'm gonna be back for the chapter 5.
Okay, hi, thanks everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. If one of my co-speakers can just nod so I know that we're getting me. Are we good? Jose, can you just skip to the next slide for me, please? Okay, so basically what I'm going to do is talk about a question of demand. So who actually votes for VOX? So I'll kind of devote my part of the presentation into 2 sections. So on the one hand, I'm going to look at the social demographics. What does the typical VOX voter look like in terms of gender, age, urban rural cleavage and things like this. And then I'll talk about some of the ideological or perhaps polemical motivations which lead individuals to move to VOX and which might ultimately help explain their rise. So what we're looking at on this graph on the screen just now, it's called the coefficient plot for those who are really interested. But what's important for me to get across is how to interpret these numbers. So these numbers on the screen represent the percentage point increase in the probability of voting with VOX associated with these different factors. So let's start off with gender. Women are significantly less likely to vote for VOX than comparable men. Now, on the one hand, we should expect this, right? Because a lot of literature on far right, radical right, and both extreme right parties shows that women are not necessarily inclined to vote for these parties. On the other hand, however, and as Lisa kind of demonstrated, VOX is socially conservative. And there is some evidence that in countries with Catholic heritage, for example, an attachment to social conservative values could lead to support for these far-right parties. But we don't observe that here in the case of VOX. What is particularly interesting about the role of gender in the case of VOX is that VOX has actively and quite aggressively pursued gender critical positions in the electoral marketplace, in that it has targeted, for example, International Women's Day as being some sort of invention of the left that is seeking to, politicize gender in a way that they don't view as desirable. So we would expect even more so in the case of VOX for women to kind of, at least women who are feminists or believe in equality between the sexes, to reject a party that kind of critiques the incorporation of women into the society on an equal playing field. I won't go through each and every one of these social demographic determinants because there's a couple I really want to focus on. One that you might perhaps see in this graph here is that the negative effects of age. Older individuals are significantly less likely to vote for VOX than younger individuals. Can you show me the next slide, please, Jose? So what we can do is we can graph the effect of age across different age brackets. So basically on the x-axis here, we're seeing the age of individuals in the population, and we have a histogram, essentially showing, how much of our respondents in our survey are a certain age category. What's interesting for us is that the effect of age is negative. So young individuals are significantly more likely to vote for VOX, the new far right, radical right populist party, and explain. Why is this relationship occurring? So there are a couple of explanations. On the one hand, young people are far more likely to be politically promiscuous. Why is that? Well, they haven't attached these strong emotional relationships with political parties, right? Because they've still to join the electoral marketplace. So they're far more prone to go for new political options. We also know, as Andrés spoke at the beginning of his chat, of his presentation, that Spain has gone through a transformation and new political parties have emerged. Specifically on the center-right, the self-penned Liberal Party, Ciudadanos, Citizens, and the far left, once Populist, now perhaps not, Unidos Podemos, originally just called Podemos. And these parties also attracted a lot of support for young people. So at least in Spain, we see a cleavage kind of emerge based on age between establishment parties who tend to reap electoral benefits from older proportions of the population and new parties who are more attractive to younger individuals. There's also perhaps a supply side factor here that's based on strategy, in that new parties are far more prolific, effective on new medium platforms such as social media, etc. VOX specifically has spent a lot of its campaign capital on investment in social media production. So they hire very advanced videographers, etc. to make TikTok, YouTube videos such as the Make Spain Great Again one, where they had a leader of the party riding in a horseback, really romantic imagery about Spain being a beautiful landscape and macho men, all this kind of stuff. Think Putin, fighting a bear, something like this. This is the kind of imagery they're going for here with the young people. But this is also different from the typical prototype of the radical right-wing party. So you can show me the next slide, please, Jose. So what we're showing here is the mean age of support amongst parties that we would probably consider VOX's contemporaries. So we had to have the AfD on the far left, which is the Alternative for Deutschland, and on the far right, we have VOX. So the mean age of the electorates of these political parties, VOX is significantly lower. Right? Okay, the mean age is still above 40, but I mean, we have a huge range of the population here, right? But it's significantly longer than their peers, which is again signaling VOX as a potentially an outlier. Now, one other core social demographic I want to speak about in relation to VOX is income or social class or perceived prestige associated with wealth. So as we show in another paper, there's a significant positive relationship with income and voting for VOX, i.e. individuals who are higher up on the socioeconomic ladder are far more likely to support for VOX. Now, this is significantly different from what we know about the typical radical right-wing party or far-right party supporter who tends to come from, allegedly, you know, this thesis of the economic losers of globalization or the left behind, or those who just are not, who are relatively deprived, i.e. they are not achieving the economic status that they would hope to achieve or relative to their peers in the economic ladder. VOX individuals are far more likely to come from wealthier backgrounds, and we also know that in some of the richest areas in Spain, such as the Barrio Salamanca in Madrid, where, you know, the average property home is well in excess of £1 million. That's €1 million, sorry, wrong country. That's where the highest density of VOX supporters are. And we can also see this in terms of their values. So what we're looking at here is a question from the European Social Survey in which individuals are asked a number of psychological questions. And this question asks individuals to what extent being rich, there's other questions such as having high status in society is important to them. And VOX's voters are significantly more concerned about issues related to status and wealth than their comparable supporters of the other parties in Spain. Now, this is important also because when it comes to far-right parties or radical right-wing parties, in most surveys, there's kind of the phenomenon of social expectation bias, meaning that respondents are not open about their support for these parties. That does not appear to be the case in Spain, where in fact association with the radical right party is very much taken as a status symbol. Individuals are going to wear little bracelets on the street that have either VOX's logo or just the Spanish flag or something like that. Individuals are going to place the Spanish flag on their balcony to communicate their association with Spanish nationalism, not necessarily an indicator of support for VOX, but definitely an association of the values that are attached to the rhetoric that VOX kind of emulates. So it's not the case that we have these shy radical right supporters that you might find in other countries as well. Next slide, please, Jose. So this is basically the social demographics of the supporter, but why are these individuals moving their support to VOX? And essentially in our book, we present this dual threat thesis. So essentially far-right parties tend to leverage or monopolize the idea that the country is under threat by some sort of actor who is going to cause damage to the pure people and the nation within the country. In the case of VOX, they're able to leverage and present two different threats to the citizens, one of them being internal, which I'll demonstrate in a second to be related to Catalan separatism, and the other being external, typical of the radical right, essentially immigration. So what we're looking at here in this graph is the effects of the events of 2017 and the Catalan independence referendum, on individual respondents in Spain's monthly social barometer, on the feeling that the government should be centralized, so they should reduce autonomous power. So basically what we're showing in this graph is respondents in the Eurobarometer in the month before the referendum took place in Catalonia and the month after. What we see is that individuals who identify on the right become significantly more inclined to favor centralization of governance. So the reduction of the powers of the autonomous regions in Spain, which is part of the raison d'etre of VOX. Next slide, please, Jose. And we essentially see the same relationship when it comes to national identity. So Spain, I'll just make this argument here, is, let's say it's plurinational, i.e. you can identify symmetrically with the European Union, the Spanish nation, and also a particular region. Say, for example, Galicia, Catalonia, or the Basque country. Some individuals have symmetrical levels of attachment with these different identities. What we see, however, is that individuals who identify on the right become far more inclined to uniquely identify with the Spanish nation as opposed to, say, equally with the Basque country in Spain or with Catalonia in Spain following the events of October 2017. So if you identify on the right, you're far more likely to diminish your multiple attachment to identities and focus purely on your Spanish national identity. Why is this important? Essentially, following the events of Catalonia, we see a significant movement among voters on the right towards increased preferences for centralization of power, so essentially reducing autonomous independence, and also an increased move towards emotional attachment with the nation as a unitary actor as opposed to a plurinational state. Next slide, please, Jose. So we can confirm that again with further data in which in one of the post-electoral surveys, I think this is the one from April, if I remember off the top of my head, individual respondents were asked, these events are going on in Catalonia, did these have an effect on your electoral decision-making calculus or not? And we see that amongst those individuals who say the events of Catalonia did have an effect on their decision-making, there's a substantively higher level of support for VOX. So if you believed the events of Catalonia were important when deciding who to vote for, there's a 25% chance that you voted for the far right in this scenario, which is a substantive amount of support from a specific strata of the population. So here we have a party who's responding to this internal threat allegedly emerging in the nation and proposing an agenda that seeks to kind of reduce these autonomous powers, centralize the state, and kind of take a hard stance against separatists. Individuals are moving their support towards this party. Next slide, Jose. The second threat I've mentioned is the external threat of immigration. So this is a classic question that you'll find in a number of surveys and papers that look at the effects of immigration, which is that of salience. So individuals are often asked in social surveys, what's the main issue that's important for you now in politics or whatever? And here we're modeling the support for VOX amongst individuals who say immigration is one of the most important issues or immigration is not one of the most important issues. Again, we see a sizable amount of support for VOX amongst those individuals who identify immigration to be a salient issue. So we have evidence that both of these threats are associated with significantly more support for the party. Next slide, Jose. We can then test if the increased support for VOX is related to kind of latent xenophobia, or it might be perhaps apeirophobia, which is the rejection of poor individuals. So here we have a response to a question that says, would you let an individual immigrate into your country if they were from? Individuals are presented with an individual from the same ethnic in-group, so a white European, an individual from an ethnic out-group, essentially a non-white, non-European, or an individual from a poor country. Across all these different immigration types, we see that VOX's supporters are significantly more likely to reject an individual's immigration access, independent of these things. So it's not necessarily the case that VOX's supporters reject Muslims, to give an example of a concrete ethnic outgroup. They're also just rejected to all types of immigration at all, including those from the same ethnic in-group, although the support is lower, but because these confidence intervals overlaps, we can't say significantly higher for the ethnic outgroup. Essentially, we can be confident, however, that all VOX's supporters are very much opposed to any form of immigration. When it comes to this immigration question, before I pass on to Jose, my own view is there's very much an endogenous relationship here. And why do I think that happens? Is because when you look at the data from Andalusia, when VOX had its first maiden success, immigration didn't have a statistically significant effect on voting for the party. It did, however, in the general elections. My own view is that because VOX was rising and becoming a salient political player, and itself as a supply side actor was making immigration more salient, it then led the public to react to that. So essentially supply was creating demand rather than demand creating supply, at least on the question of immigration. And I say that because actually the objective levels of immigration that have hit Spain, I say hit, that has negative connotations, I shouldn't have used that term, but the negative figures of immigration that have arrived in Spain didn't necessarily go through some exogenous shock that would trigger a substantive increase in the demand side factors. My own view that it's rather that this now electorally successful supply side actor was able to increase the salience of that policy issue. But we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A, and I will pass over to Jose, which will talk about Vox's relationship with democracy.
Okay, and together with Lisa, let us to talk just very briefly, because I think that we are a little bit on the Aragorn, you know, the one of the main actors of the Lord of the Rings. So trying to fight against all of the enemies of Spain. So Aragorn is Vox, or Vox is Aragorn, trying to fight against the media, the left-wing media that goes against the integrity of Spain and the unity of Spain, trying to fight against the LGTB collective, trying to fight against the feminist movements, etc., etc. So here you can trying to fight against the Republican ideology, etc., etc. So trying to find the relationship between democratic preferences, that is something that was previously addressed by other authors, that tries to find the relationship between far-right parties and democratic preferences. We do this with the case of Vox. So here the second graph, Lisa. I don't know.
You want me to go? You want me to go, or you want to present?
No. If you want to. Okay. So here is just a descriptive overview of the regime preferences for the different Spanish political parties, right? So we have on top, on the left side, the People's Party preferences, and then on the bottom in the middle, the voters of Vox and the regime preferences. So one is democracy is always preferable. The second element, or the second point, is doesn't matter the political regime. And the third element is sometimes an authoritarian regime is needed in a country. So here, in a descriptive way, we find that the voters of Vox are the ones with higher preferences in this third element. So that is really significant. And in the case of Vox, it's very clear. It's an outlier comparing with the other political parties. So finally, trying to find statistically controlling with other factors, the ones that was previously analyzed by Stuart, age, gender, other political and attitudes, etc., we find that democratic preferences or regime preferences matters in terms to vote for Vox against other political parties. And this is very relevant. Here we have two figures, two graphs. The left side figure is with data for the post-electoral survey of April 2019, and the right side figure is with data of the November 2019 elections. And we filter with by age, by different age cohorts. And we find that those voters that considers that democracy is not the best regime, and that belongs to the youngest cohorts, are the ones more able to cast a vote for Vox than other voters. So this is very relevant, because it's not only a relationship between political preferences or regime preferences and the vote for a specific party, but it's something that we intentionally find in the younger cohorts. And this is something that we need to worry for the future, or at least I think that. Well, just to finally try to assess the relationship or the future of Vox, so I'm looking forward. Stuart?
Yep, sorry, here I'm back. So Jose, just show the final slide. Essentially what I'm showing here is just the trends in political parties in Spain's polling performance, essentially up to the latter part of last year. My takeaway from this graph is essentially Vox is, at least in the short to medium term, a party here that's likely going to stay. It might be that the party itself doesn't have long-term trajectory. You know, party systems tend to converge when copycat tactics come into play. But the effects of copycat tactics themselves have significant policy implications for citizens. A couple of examples of that could just come from the region of Madrid, where the PP's candidate, Isabel Díaz Ayuso, has very much tried to monopolize Vox's rhetorical talking points in order to essentially stop the hemorrhage of voters that the centre-right party is suffering to the radical right. It's also the case that, you know, Vox has provided confidence and supply agreements with a number of regional and local governments across Spain. It's likely to be the case that these continue or expanded upon in future electoral competitions. At the moment, we're going to face regional elections, for example, in Castilla-La Mancha, or is it Castilla y León? I've now just tripped up there, I'm not sure. But I mean, in either case, the polling performance of Vox is so strong that it's very likely that a confidence supply agreement will come into force again, if not a full-fledged coalition, because Vox itself has basically tested the waters of coalition formation and now wants to get seats at the table rather than just be these silent actors that pop up centre-right and Ciudadanos-led coalitions with Vox's support from the background. I guess for political parties, it's very concerning the high levels of support for Vox amongst young voters. There's not a strong level of attachment for the conventional centre-right amongst the young. And as I mentioned before, there is not this kind of social expectation bias that means individuals who are young are kind of masking their support. Vox's supporters among the youth are like out and proud in many cases. So they are forming the attachment to political parties that we used to see with kind of traditional establishment parties taking place amongst these new alternatives as well. Part of the kind of the lack of having these shy voters might be a function of the fact that the PP from the very beginning, since Vox emerged at the regional and local election, has been open to engaging in negotiations with the party, which has a mainstreaming effect, right? It's not the case that there was the cordon sanitaire that took place, you know, for example, in France and Germany, where, you know, the AfD was excluded from any form of coalition formation, even in confidence and supply, you know, non-governing agreements. From the beginning, the PP and also the self-penned Ciudadanos, and I say self-penned quite purposefully there because, you know, it's very uncommon for a liberal party in Europe to engage in government formation talks with a far-right party. Again, there is no government in Spain that has Vox in a government role. These are, they're basically supporting right-wing governments on the background, you know, during votes of investiture and in confidence and supply. But that is likely to change in the regional elections that are due to take place in a few weeks and then going forward as well.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Yep, I can see the screen. Thank you so much for this really, really interesting presentation on all these dimensions of the party. I was actually fascinated by some of this data, some of the demand and supply side data, and I myself have some questions, but I have a lot of other questions to go through first. So I think the best way, as I said, we've got circa half an hour, so I think the best way to do it, let me ask them in blocks of 3. Just for the interest of time, let's not have really lengthy answers. So maybe you want to decide among you who would like to address them. Let me start from a couple of questions from José. Hi, José, and David. And the first question is, so this is for any of you. When did Vox turn into a populist party and to what degree? So that's question number 1. And also from José's, a second follow-up question, have you found any evidence of who the ideologues behind this new strategy were? Do you see these radical right parties becoming increasingly intertwined internationally, leaving aside their nationalism and generating a sort of right-wing populist international in the long run? Let's start with these two then, and then we'll take it from here. I've got loads more.
Okay, I think that Lisa is the best person to answer the question regarding populism, if I'm not mistaken, but I think.
Yeah, I'm gonna take the first one. So I think, at least in your analysis, but also looking at other colleagues that measured actually populist discourse, I think there is quite an agreement that VOX is a populist radical right party. And I believe that even though nationalism was the main cause of VOX's success, at least at the national level, right? I think that switching to populism was very relevant. And I'm saying that before, I'm saying that because as we saw in the supply side chapter, there was a sort of convergence in the Spanish party system before the entrance of VOX. So I think that picturing all these parties in the system as the same was a key for VOX success, right? And populism does that. Basically, they say we are different, all of the other are the same, and we are pure, they're corrupt. And we need to remember that corruption in populist, from the populist point of view, is not like a financial corruption. It's a corruption in the sense that basic elites do not act on the behalf of to basically satisfy the desires and interests of the people. So I think that the convergence in the Spanish party system gave VOX a good opportunity with the populist discourse to enter and do quite well from an electoral point of view. And the other point I want to make is that to what extent VOX is a populist party? I mean, is the populism high or low? I do believe that in general, populist radical right parties are much less nativist, at least in Europe, much more nativist than populist. So populism is a residual category. And Casmude himself, in his categorization of populist radical right parties, told us that in general, populism is a residual category. There are like some exceptions outside of Italy, outside of Europe, but I think that for what VOX is concerned, I think nativism and authoritarianism also, as we saw with the traditional morality thing, are the main categories. I don't know if I.
Thank you.
Reply. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, let me move on to a batch of questions here that we also have. So first question, you talked about the emergence of two new parties, Podemos and Ciudadanos. There is also a third party, UPID or UPYD. That seems to be one of the things that started a centralist reaction to independence movements that was later picked up by Ciudadanos and indeed VOX. Was UPYD important in opening the first crack of space that allowed VOX to emerge? Very interesting question. I'll go with 3 questions and then you can choose who goes for what. Second question, we have a wave of populist radical right-wing parties like the Lega, the PVV, etc. More recently, we've had Trump and we've had Brexit. Does the emergence of VOX fit more closely with one or another of these phenomena? And then finally, question number 3, it seems that VOX scores much higher for national way of life when looking at its manifesto. Is that code for Catalonia?
Perhaps I can go, colleagues, unless there's an objection. So I'll tackle the first question about UPD first. So UPD did have some electoral success, but my own interpretation is that it was marginal because it never gained the kind of king-queen maker function that some of the other main parties did when they had their bloc success in kind of 2015 following the financial crisis. About like the crack that allowed Vox to emerge, I actually think the rise of Podemos and Ciudadanos is essential here. Essentially because, my own view, and I kind of talk about this a lot when I discuss Vox, is the learning process that new party success in 2015 had for the electorate. So imagine you're a citizen in an electoral system where you're socialized into thinking basically that you have these two political players and no one's going to crack the egg because the electoral system is set up in a certain way. All of a sudden, however, you have this substantive shock and new players emerge. All of a sudden, the electorate is being socialized into realizing that actually new parties can become electorally viable. That means when Vox appears on the scene in 2013 and then gains salience following Catalonia, voters are more prepared to kind of take the gamble and vote for a minor party because they've already become aware that minor parties actually can have success later on. Whether Vox falls into the first wave of like Lega PPV or like Trump and Brexit, something later on, my own view is that it can't fit into either of these categories. Again, I very much believe that in a counterfactual world where the territorial conflict didn't reach its crescendo that it did in 2017, that Vox would not be an electoral viable contender today. As I've said, immigration had moments of saliency in Spain, in 2004, potentially at the beginning of the financial crisis, but that never translated into any electoral expression of those concerns. That's only a post hoc function of the kind of catalyst events of 2017. I think my co-authors agree with me, but perhaps they have a more critical view. But I mean, I think it's a strong claim, but I do stick by it that in a counterfactual scenario, without the events of 2017 in Catalonia, we wouldn't see Vox as a political player to the same viability that it is today. I'll let Lisa perhaps answer the last question about national way of life and how it's coded in the manifesto.
Yeah. Yes, we actually in the chapter we when analyzing each one of these issues, we made a link about this national way of life, the defense of the Spanish values with strong centralist and nationalist discourse of Vox. And I mean, it is really, if you remember the comparative table we had, I mean, I think Vox is the only party that is so strong on nationalism. And as Stuart was saying, I think it has greatly to do with the Catalan issue. Because I mean, populist radical right as much more nativist than nationalist most of the time. I think with respect to Vox, I think immigration came after nationalism. And from this point of view, it's a sort of strange PRR, at least in Europe. Outside of Europe, for example, in Latin America, I think that we have some examples that are like closer to Vox than the other PRR, at least a classic one in Europe. But yes.
All right, thank you. I think I'm going to move on to a couple of questions from Danny Setra. And I'm going to start, he's got 3 questions. I'm going to start from question number 3, which is for Andre, for you, which is, do you anticipate the decline of the Catalan independence agenda to result in changes in Vox's public discourse or electoral appeal, i.e. greater emphasis on immigration, future references to territorial politics? Let me go ask the other questions too, and then Question number 1 would be for Stuart, and then Andre, you can add something too if you feel like it. Is the answer to who votes for Vox different in sub-state nations such as Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia? And then finally, question for Lisa. According to your findings, would it be accurate to characterize Vox's party ideology as an update of the traditional national Catholic strand of Spanish nationalism?
Thank you, Daphne. Well, the first thing if you allow me, I will do the adding to the first question of Daniel, because it's very tightly intertwined with the question that Stuart answered on the previous round. And one of the things where you see a difference between voters of so-called sub-state nations and the rest of Spain is in the level of voting to start with. They are voting usually less in those places than in the rest of Spain. And this is not something that started with Vox. If you have a look at where the voter revenue came from for UPyD and citizens, you find the same in all of these regions, Basque Country, Catalonia, Galicia, Navarra. They always got even Canary Islands. They always got fewer votes than in the rest of Spain. And then there are some exceptions, Valencia, but it's sort of in a middle case. Yeah. So there is something in which Vox was following the pattern, just with a better structure of opportunity in 2019 than the one that the others had several years before. The demise of or the loss of importance of the Catalan challenge, we will have to wait to see whether this will be a topic that will be losing much of importance, because there is still quite potential for future challenges and for discussion there. And I am not that I think there is some sort of overstatement of the loss of importance of this issue in Spanish politics. So I am not sure that the actual fact will be like that. In any event, letting aside the slide of Vox vote intention Stu showed at the end of the presentation, there are some signs that Vox is trying to add importance to other components, and more specifically immigration, as Daniel Cetra was suggesting. And we can see this in the campaigns, like the very well-known campaign in Madrid subway. So there is also some learning between parties in their strategies and in seeing what is working for this kind of parties. And Vox has seen that the immigration issue has worked well for most of them. So it is, I think, increasingly and repeatedly trying to build up on that so as to get another issue that can sustain their vote, whether or not Catalan independence becomes stronger or weaker.
If I can just quickly just respond to the point made by Andreas just in the final part of his comment, is that I also agree that, you know, the immigration issue is definitely the direction of travel that the party is going in. But my interpretation of this is that from a party strategy point of view, this is the only way that Vox is going to expand its electoral revenue. So as I mentioned in my part, you know, it is the party of the well-off at the moment. But, you know, the well-off is only a certain proportion of the electorate. If they, you know, want to make further inroads, they need to be able to attract new voters And this is now my reading, is that they are flirting with the conventional far-right voter, who is, you know, the ordinary Spaniard who, you know, perhaps might feel that the welfare state is not providing what it should provide. Economic growth is not what you would expect, etc. Right? Whether that can actually work is up for debate, but that's my reading of why they are engaged in this new rhetorical approach, and it's essentially electioneering. They need to get beyond people who live in Barrio Salamanca, who these attempts are not necessarily going to work with.
Super. Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, so what I'm going to do is have a final round of questions. So I'll just ask 3 more. Apologies to those who have asked the question and we won't be able to answer it. So I'm just going to choose and be a little cheeky and add my own in there as well. So I'm going to go for one here in the chat box. For me, is a question is, how does the profile of the VOX voter compare to other populist radical parties? And I think Stuart did pick up a little bit on this when you were talking about demand, telling us that it's a bit of the voter profile is a bit of an outlier. And I want to extend this question myself to the supply side as well. And I know, again, you showed us a little bit of a selective sort of comparison between what VOX stands for and other far-right parties. And I was thinking, so in my own work that you might know, and this is a bit of a nationalism question, actually, I've sort of categorized far-right parties in 2 types. So there are the ethnic nationalist ones that draw on sort of really biological criteria of national belonging, versus what I call the civic ones, which are more the ideological ones. And that's the sort of how they treat nationalism. And then in the economic sort of welfare positions, there are those who tend to come from right-wing parties, so they're quite liberal economically and moving a little bit to welfare chauvinism. And then there are the ones that come sort of from more fascist parties, and they tend to be really, really statist from the beginning. And I found that it's easy to categorize European parties, but when it came to VOX, I had real difficulties because I really don't understand which of these dimensions. So if you could shed light on that, that would be great. So both a bit on the voters, but also on the parties. Then finally, another question, I think that links, this is from Caroline. Stuart, your suggestion that VOX as a supply side actor is creating demand for anti-immigration. How does it really do this? Is it creating demands in other areas as well, for example, anti-gender views? And then a final question about memory. I was also fascinated by this question, thinking of it myself. Older voters are less likely to vote for VOX. Well, surely that's because of the memory of Franco. And here, can I add the comparative dimension? Again, when you were presenting, I was thinking Greece, 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 Greece. And there are so many similarities, yet differences as well. So, you know, is it the memory of Franco? And if it is, how has that, maybe you can add a comparative note on this. Why did this memory pan out really differently in some other Southern European countries?
So I'll respond to Caroline's question first, if you'd like, about parties able to create demand. So the classic example I use when I teach this kind of phenomenon is UKIP in the UK and how it was able to create demand for Euroscepticism. So there's quite a lot of polling data that showed, whilst the Conservative Party cared a lot about Europe, the average Brit did not. Well, what the UKIP was able to do, however, was to attach a policy concern that they had, Euroscepticism, to something that was important for the average citizen, which was the NHS, public services, etc. And they essentially portrayed immigration as a threat to something you care about, NHS. And VOX is essentially doing the same thing. They view immigration to be inimical to society, whether that be because of, you know, latent xenophobia or economic concerns. That's, you know, I can't get into the mind of Pascal, but that's whatever their rationale is, they're able to create demand side concerns for immigration by attaching it to other domestic concerns. Very important for Spain for a long period of time, but specifically following the financial crisis. Poor economic opportunities for young people, lack of state resources to help development, welfare, distribution, etc. Whether they can do this in other areas, my view is yes. For example, in the area of gender concerns, is because they're also able to polarize concerns by attaching them to specific ideological beliefs. For example, Vox has very effectively, in my view, been able to present advocacy of gender equality and feminist values to the left. So because of this kind of rhetorical demonization of gender equality as being leftist, individuals who don't necessarily like the left or identify them are then moving to become more critical of these ideas in the same way that Vox would do as well. So that would be my response to Caroline's question. Jose, I don't know if you want to speak about the memory or.
Okay, yeah, that's very good. I just wanted to say as well regarding the classification of Vox and following the question or the reflection of Daphne, that I consider that the right-wing position is very relevant in the case of Vox. So we very much know that those on the right side are more able to vote for Vox. This is something that is really clear, but also nationalism or the Spanish nationalist sentiment is something very important in the case of Vox. And this is something that is very clear in the case in this particular party, because it's very connected with the Spanish, with the preferences regarding the organization of the country, more centralization, etc., etc. Because the centralization and decentralization preferences regarding the state are closely connected with ideology in Spain. So right-wing voters are those more in favor to centralize different aspects. And this is something connected with the past. And this is something connected with the nostalgia of the past and with flirting with the idea of a glorious Spain, a pre-constitution of 1977. And this is something that is present in the case of Vox. The leaders of Vox flirting with this idea. They try to use some ideas and some rhetoric that emphasize the past of Spain. And that's why they divide the society into two blocks, the anti-Spain and the Spain alive. And this is something that was used in 1936 and in the Civil War. And this is something very clear in the case of Vox. They use the rhetoric of the nostalgia and the fascist past also as an instrument of a populist rhetoric. This is not to say that voters of Vox are fascist voters, but is to say that voters of Vox are political discontent voters, voters that remember that in the past they were more rich, with more resources, etc., and voters that remember that Spain was more solid in the past than nowadays. So this is something very clear in the case of Vox, and it's something that maybe we share with the Italian case, with the Greece case, and with other Southern European countries, and how this type of parties are able to play or to use this type of ideas to engage and lure it the different electoral arena. That's the point.
If I can have a very, very, very final, because I appreciate we're out of time, reflection on what Jose said, is that maybe those who are not familiar with Spain in the comparative context of historical legacies, is that there is not the same institutional demonization of pre-democratic Spain as there is, for example, I can't speak to the Greece case, but in the case of Germany, for example, it's not the case that pro-Francoist demonstrations are illegal in the same way that pro-Nazi demonstrations are illegal in Germany, for example. Basically, since the transition took place, there have been masses, as in, religious masses, public demonstration protests that have been sympathetic towards the regime, post-transition to democracy, and also the idea of reopening the wounds about the transition, ley memoria histórica, this type of thing is politicized. Basically, the left as the bloc wants it and the right doesn't. So there's not the same, social stigma, I would say. I mean, there is, but it's not to the same extent that perhaps we observe in other former authoritarian regimes, at least in Western Europe. I can't speak to elsewhere.
Can I just quickly address Daphne's question? Just maybe you guys can help me out with this. First of all, I think that I agree that there are different kinds of populist radical right parties in terms of their not just nativism, they like approach to nativism, and at least I'm thinking in comparative perspective that Vox is much more like Brothers of Italy than the League, to compare it with Italy. And I know if this is about the politicization of the democratic path, which in Spain is much more closer than in Italy. But I think it has strongly to do with that somehow. And the other thing was about the welfare state chauvinism, which to me was really surprising when we got the data from Partido Nuestro project that Vox scored that high on welfare state expansion, since I thought that Vox, I wouldn't have defined Vox as a welfare chauvinist party. So I was really, I didn't code the data myself, but I was really surprised. Jose and I have also analyzed like other type of discourse, not related to the manifesto, and it was evident that they are much more liberal in economic terms than the other populist radical right parties, at least in the first generation. I'm thinking about the League. I'm thinking about Front Nacional. So, I mean, the data said that, but I think we all agree that there is not your classic welfare chauvinist populist radical right party. I don't know if you want to chip in, but.
Does anyone want to add a final word, or are you covered by your colleagues? Seems like, Lisa, you covered everyone. So okay, I think we have a few more questions, but we've really run out of time. We're almost at an hour and a half, so I will have to end this. And I just want to say just a couple of things first. Thank you so much. I think both me and ASEN and all the audience will agree. We know so much more now about Vox and have so much information available to understand this party, this outlier, if you like, better. So thank you so much to Stuart, to Lisa, to Jose, and to Andre for enlightening us and presenting their book. If someone wants to, we can, I think, David, we can do this, put also the book information in the link so everybody could take a look at the book if you're more interested in getting more details on the data, on the supply, on the demand, who votes for this party, what does this party say, etc. Before I end, I am told to give a couple of announcements. So yeah, thanks for joining us for ASEN. We have another event on February 9th. We are going to discuss Carlo Basta's new book, The Symbolic State, Minority Recognition, Majority Backlash and Secession in Multinational Countries. Then on the 17th of February, we have Gurjapal Singh and Giorgio Shani discussing their new book, Sikh Nationalism from Dominant Minority to an Ethno-Religious Diaspora. They will be joined by John Hutchinson and Atsuko Ichijo and Ian Talbot. You can find information on both these events on our ASEN website, and of course more information about ASEN, about the conference coming up, etc. But for now, can I just thank our speakers again and everyone for joining us, and yes, have a lovely evening. morning, afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.